Space Coastal. And in this video, we're going to be just playing around with different watercolor techniques. We're going to do washes, play around with different brushes, see what they can do, try different papers, just have fun figuring out the watercolor medium material, mixing different values of paint and whatnot. So if you want to figure out how, let's get started. So welcome to Healing Art Happy Hour, Watercolor Foundations 2. And we're going to be talking about techniques. So last week we went over all of the different materials and how to shop for materials, what you might need, what you might want to use. And now we're going to talk about ways that you can get familiar with those supplies and materials. And I have some exercises, and I will be going through this presentation, showing you the exercises here, but then I'm going to be demonstrating those exercises on my demonstration screen. So if you're confused by the layout on the presentation, don't worry. Hopefully it's clear. But I know it's easier to see it done, and so we're going to do both. So hopefully that'll clarify anything that might be confusing. All right, the first thing I want to talk about is just for, especially for those of you who weren't here for last week, I'm not going to go into a deep dive of supplies, but I just want to talk about the basic things that I'm going to be using for demonstrations today in case you want to follow along. And this is the basic supplies that I would say you want to have. So I would suggest 2 containers of water. You can use, you can recycle basically anything. I use jars. I like glass because it can stain the plastic, but so a couple jars. I use one for clean water and one for dirty water, meaning I dip in the dirty first if I'm trying to rinse my brush, and then I dip it in the clean water so I come out with a clean brush. If I'm trying to go from one color to another, I want to make sure I'm not contaminating the color too much by leaving that pigment in there. I also have my palette. Now a palette consists of the color wells or the paint wells where it holds the paint. And then there's also mixing trays or mixing wells. You'll often see they might be divided like this, but bigger, or they might be one big tray area. And you do want to have something. You can use just a plate or anything like that too. Of course, you're going to need brushes. You're going to need a cloth for dabbing off paint and water. You're going to need a painting support. Now this you don't have to have for the exercises, but I will be using that, and I just use some plexiglass, but you can use a piece of cardboard or anything that you can tape the painting down to, and this allows you to tape the painting down, take the paper down, and be able to rotate around the painting as you're going, because sometimes you may need to shift the angles of it. It also allows you to put the roll of masking tape. So masking tape for not only taping down the paper, but also you can use the roll underneath your painting support to bring that support at an angle, kind of like an easel would allow you to adjust the angle of your painting, and that gives you a little bit of an angle for doing some washes that I'll be talking about in a little bit. And then of course, I think, let's see, no, maybe I got everything. So those are the primary things that you need for what we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, getting started is really as easy as 1, 2, 3. First, you're going to mix up the desired value of point paint. I'm going to be giving you an exercise that'll help you work on that in just a minute. But basically, to mix that up, you're going to wet the brush. Always wet the brush first before you go into pigment, because you're always going to be adding water to the paint. You're never going to be using the concentrated paint. Watercolors are not like acrylics in that watercolors, they're very concentrated pigment and they're not to be used full paint. So you're always going to be adding water to it to dilute that concentrated pigment. You'll never take the full amount of paint and put it on the page. That's very wasteful. It's very expensive, because a little goes a very long way if you use it wisely and you mix your water in. You can either have solid paints, like pans that comes in a pan, it's already solid, or if you dry your paints on your palette. So for example, this palette here, I actually squeezed out from the tube and then I let it set, I guess, if you will, or dry. Now my paint is stays very gummy, very kind of sticky because it has a honey base, but oftentimes they'll dry even firmer than what mine will. But that'll just allow you to manipulate the paint without taking like a whole clump of the wet paint. If you're using the paint straight out of the tube, you have to be very careful not to get too much paint, and you don't need as much water. So some paints release that pigment easily, like if we're talking about the solid paints. Some binder is very easy to dissolve and allow that pigment to be released, and sometimes it's not very easy, so you have to add more water and scrub more. Sometimes people use a different brush, maybe a less expensive brush or not as nice a brush, maybe a bigger bristled brush to do their mixing, and then they'll paint with a different brush. So because sometimes just that loosening up the paint, scrubbing in those paint palettes to lift that pigment can be hard on the brushes. And also if you're mixing up a big pool of water on your palette, you may want a bigger brush than what you're going to use on your project. So it's perfectly fine to just use a different brush that works better for mixing up your value, the right value that you're wanting to use. And basically how you do that is you wet the brush and then you dip it into the paint, and like I said, be careful if it's wet. The wet paint, you just dip like the little tip of it in there, and then you take that, you transfer all of that to the mixing area, and you add water or paint until you get to the right value of that color that you want. Obviously, the more paint you use, you're going to be adding more pigment, because paint is basically ground up pigment or ground up minerals of a color in a binder that carries that pigment. So basically the more paint you add, the more of that pigment you're adding, and the more concentrated the color is going to be, the closer it's going to get to the color as it looks on your palette compared to a watered down, more pastel version of it. So once you get the mix to the tonal value that you want, then you can load your brush that you're using for your project, load that with the paint just by, rolling those bristles in there, soaking up that paint, and then you brush it on the paper. Simple as that. And it sounds more complicated with mixing, but we're going to have all these exercises so you can practice all these steps. So that's the basic 3 steps. You mix to the desired value of paint, you load the brush with that mixed paint, and then you brush to the paper. Now, I was talking about the values, and this is an exercise that will help you practice getting the value that you want, because some of the biggest challenges, especially for new watercolorists, is to adjust that color pigment, the water/pigment ratio. Sometimes that can be quite challenging. And it's really an important aspect to know, to get used to. And it takes practice. It just takes practice. So the more pigment that you have compared to the water, the deeper value the color is going to be. Now, when I say value, you can see a couple things here. There's this painted value scale, and then this is a grayscale version to kind of get an idea from white to black. And you can see all the shades of gray in between. So if I were to compare this colored version to this grayscale, I would say this value here is probably similar to this value, or maybe even this value on this scale. And of course, this color of paint is not going to get to the value of black, because this color doesn't go to that dark. If I was using something like a Payne's Gray or some black paint, I would be able to get probably this range. I could go all the way from this all the way to this color here. So each color in itself has a value. And when you're doing this exercise, I do recommend that you use a color that has a darker value option. Like, I would not suggest using yellow, because it would be very hard to see the range of values. So just for this exercise, I would say using, something like a dark blue or even red works fine. Really any color but yellow would work fine, as long as it has a nice, a deeper, darker tone color. And this is the fully saturated. And then this is steps you through how to go from this to this really light. Now you can go in both directions. This is describing how to do it in this direction from dark to light. So basically to create your deepest tonal value, you keep adding that paint, just like we talked about. You go into your paint tray, get a little paint, add it to their mixing tray, and then you keep adding a little bit more paint until the color does not deepen anymore and it looks very close to the color that's in the tray. And then you know that you've saturated, basically you've filled that water with as many of those pigment particles as that water is going to take, because there's a point where the water won't take anymore. If you've ever filled a glass of water with salt, you know how sometimes there's salt at the bottom. That means that the water is full of the salt and can no longer dissolve any more salt, and it's saturated. And that's what you kind of want to do with that, with your pigment, is you want to add enough pigment to where it's not going to get any darker. It's not going to take on any more of those pigment particles. Then once you have that one, you can take some of that deepest tone and you move it to another area on your tray. And then you add water to that until you get your next tone that you're looking for. So it might take like 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 brushfuls of water, depending on the size of your brush, to lighten that up to your next value. And then you just do the same process over and over until you get to that lightest shade. So that's a little exercise you can do to just practice mixing and what you get and how you can adjust your values. All right, exercise 3 is to practice the brush strokes. So now you've kind of learned about adjusting your tones, mixing up your paint. Now let's play with those brushes. And whatever brushes you have, just play around with each one of them. Do exercises like this. And if you have, it doesn't matter what paper you use to do these exercises, you're just learning to see what shapes your brushes can make. So try straight lines. You can apply various pressure to the bristles. So you could start very lightly across the page, and then you can press it down and see how the shape of the line changes. You can try rotating the brush. You can try curvy lines or circles, wiggle the brush around, hold the brush at different angles to the page. That can change the effect of it, because if you're holding, for example, a round brush that has a very pointy tip, completely straight upright, perpendicular from the page, you're going to be using that very, very, very tip. And that's a very small point. So if you're trying to do little dots, you might tip it straight up and use a perpendicular. But if you're using the body of the bristles, then you're gonna angle it down more, and you're gonna push down to get to use that body of the bristles, and you're gonna get a lot bigger brush stroke. So play around with where you hold the brush, whether you're close to the ferrule, close to the bristles, or far away. See how that feels, see the difference that you get from holding it different. And then the different orientations against the paper, or also that the brush bristles are to the paper. So for example, if it's a flat brush, you can hold it where the flat edge is all the bristles are laying flat against the paper, and they're creating the widest stroke. But if you rotate that and the bristles are all in line with each other, you're going to get a more narrow stroke. So try that too. Whatever obviously if it's a round brush, it's not going to be different. Rotating the brush, different orientations. But with other shapes of brushes, that will make a difference. So try those out. Also try rotating the brush during the brush stroke. So again, this would, while you're actually making the stroke, rotate the brush. So that would work really well with the flat brush, for example, because that's going to change as you go along. So you're going to go from a thick line to a thinner line. You know what I want to do? Let's see. I want to make sure that, okay. I'm sorry, I had to do something with the waiting room. Okay. try longer strokes, short strokes, dotting, and then slow versus rapid. See how much paint you apply if you're doing a slower stroke versus a quick stroke. And then just observe what you get with those different ways that you use the brush, the different shapes that you get, and the different characteristics of the strokes of paint that you have doing that. And you'll find some interesting things. You'll notice, according to these visuals here, you can see that all of these different brushes that are out there, all these different shapes of brushes, they have different features, different shapes that they can create. And of course, you can do different things with each of them, you know, have multiple designs that you can create with them. But these are just some examples here. So just be aware that there are, you know, lots of different shapes of brushes out there. They all have their different pros and cons and different shapes that they're designed to be able to make easier to do. But play around with what you have and don't worry about having everything. The main ones, like I said last week, that I would suggest having is at least a round brush, a round pointed brush that gives you the point where you can get those small details, and then it has the full body that you can get the wider stroke. And then also I do recommend having a flat brush for doing washes and glazes and things like that, and more geometrical shapes. So those are my two favorite. I have a few other ones in my collection as well, but those are a couple basic shapes that I would recommend. Now, when you're doing this, you might notice some characteristics that you may or may not like. Sometimes you can add too much water or too much, or the paint might be too wet, or you might have gotten too much on your brush. For example, if you're using a natural brush, natural brushes are really very thirsty, and they suck up a lot of the liquid, so they hold a lot of fluid and a lot of paint. So sometimes you might have too much on there, and when you go to take the brush to the page, it might be dripping, and you don't want to accidentally inadvertently drip on your project. So be very careful. You can always remove the excess moisture by dragging the bristles across the lip of the jar, or you can blot it on that cloth towel or paper towel or something, whatever you have. And you'll also notice pooling up on your page, and you can go ahead and lift that excess pooling off of the page with a paintbrush or a paper towel. You can just touch the paper towel along the edge to lift up any extra pooling that happens on the page. If you leave that there, you might have issues, like you might get these blooms, for example. Now, I like blooms, and sometimes I want those to show up. So, but what this is basically evidence that there was a pool of paint here and they dried at different stages. So instead of drying evenly, the edges dried first, and then more of the pigment settled there, and then they didn't dry as quickly in the center. So you just get different texture, and if you want that, then that's one way to do it, is have some varying wetness on your page, and that'll help you get that effect if you're looking for it. It is a little bit harder to control when you have too much paper. So again, you can lift, or you can just blot your brush on the cloth, and that'll help so that you don't inadvertently drip. You don't usually want to inadvertently drip, because it could either if you wipe the drip, it'll lift the pigment because you've just reactivated the pigment where it dripped, and it'll lift, and then you'll have like a lighter spot there. Or if you leave it there, it'll create some of these blooms as well. And then if it's too dry, you'll notice the bristles start to separate. You'll run out of paint very quickly. The brush strokes will be more visible, and you may or may not want that. Or you'll get a dry brush effect where you're going to see a lot of the white underneath where the paint goes. And sometimes this is an effect you want. It looks kind of like water, like ocean water, where the light is like the reflection. And so sometimes you want to use that effect. But if you don't want that effect, if you're trying to get a nice even wash, you're not going to want that to happen. So you're going to want to make sure that you have enough paint on there that you're not going to have a problem with running out. And that depends, of course, on how long the brush stroke you're going to be making. If you're making shorter strokes and you have a brush that you know, as long as the brush can hold enough pigment to get you across your complete stroke, or you just have to blend in your strokes together. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that in a little bit as well. The other exercise is to practice playing with water and paint. So you know, watercolors has a little bit of art and a little bit of science, because it's about how the paper interacts with the water and the pigment. And it can be quite unexpected, some of the results that you get. And so here are some examples of some different techniques that you can do. You can do a wet on dry, which is what we talked about when you're creating that value exercise. I didn't talk at all about, you know, doing that with wet on wet. That's just basically taking the brush that's loaded with paint and putting it on dry paper. So that's wet on dry. And it creates a little bit more defined, more crisp edges. It's a little bit easier to control. You don't get bleeding, or, you know, you don't get a lot of surprises. It's best for getting details and things like that. But if you want to have fun, the wet on wet gives you some interesting results. So in this example, I just put down clear water, and then I touched in some pigment in the middle, and it bloomed out and created this really feathery, smooth edges around, because the pigment did not fill the full area of that circle. And what happens is if you do that, wherever you put that wet paint down first, the pigment's not going to move beyond that. So if it gets to the edge of that circle, it's just going to stop there. So if I were to fill this more with pigment, it would fill all the way to the edges of the wet circle, and then it would stop there. But you get this nice sort of atmospheric, ethereal look to it compared to this, you know, hard lined, very, you know, pretty stationary, you know, I don't know, stationary is not the right word. This is just a little smoother. It's not as organic looking. And then if you have two colors in the mix, and they touch, you get a little touch there, a little kiss, then you can get these color bursts. Depending on the pigment, different pigment behaves different ways when it's mixed with other colors. So some paints like to move a lot when they're mixed with other colors. And this is going to depend on the paper that you have, the paints that you have, the color within the paints that you're using, because it depends on what that pigment is made of. But it's going to behave different. And this is what's so exciting about watercolor, is you just never know what exactly you're going to get. You're going to get some fun mixing and mingling going on the page. And that's really exciting to me. I like when that happens. So this is an example of that. And you can push or pull color. Like in this case, I think this was like a kiss technique where I had this yellow down and then I brought in the blue and I just touched it there, and this blue exploded into that yellow. But sometimes it might just move a little bit, and sometimes it might just really pull it in. So it just depends on. Was there a question? I'm hearing some sounds, or just you're not muted, I think. Okay, I muted you. If you did have a question, please unmute yourself again and go ahead and ask the question. But I think you were just unmuted, and David. Okay, so this is a fun exercise, and you can use this technique with a lot of other techniques that we're going to talk about, like the washes and things like that. You can either do it in a wet on dry or wet on wet, and that just means obviously the paintbrush is wet, and then it's whatever the paper is. So wet on dry just means you're taking the wet brush onto dry paper, and wet on wet just means you're taking the wet brush onto wet paper. And the wet can be either water or it can be paint. So it doesn't have to be on a clear paint. It can be, or clear water, it can be paint or clear water, just as long as it's wet. And then here are some examples. This exercise is just practicing washes, and these are primarily when you're trying to do like the background. For example, if you're trying to do a sky or some kind of background before you really start with the subject, you want to be able to do these washes. And here are some different options that you can try out as an exercise. A flat wash is basically the same color, the same value all the way through. So it's very uniform. And this is done by these steps. So basically it's easier if you put your painting support up on that masking tape roll and just put it at like a 5-degree angle, and that helps that pigment and the paint move down the page as you do your strokes. And that'll make more sense once you see me actually do that, because that'll basically move all of the wet down to the bottom edge of the first stroke, and then you go into that, you touch that on the next stroke. So you want to make sure you mix up enough paint, because you're going to move quickly because you don't want any of it drying. You're going to try to create a really smooth, uniform wash. So you mix up enough paint, and then using a large loaded brush, you're going to go ahead and paint horizontally across the page, and then reload the brush, and then go back the other direction, starting where you left off, and making sure that you overlap the wet edge of the previous stroke. So you're basically blending those two strokes together so it looks like one continuous stroke. The next option is the gradient wash, and that's where the tonal value changes. So it goes from a dark or deep tonal value to light. And you basically do the same process, except for that you just add water to dilute the pigment as you go down. So I do maybe the full saturation, and then I add a little water, and then I do the next row, and then I add a little water in the next row, and so on and so forth, so that you get this nice gradient from dark to light. Now you can do that in reverse as well. You can start with a very light wash and then work darker. So it really just depends on what you're looking for. You just would add pigment instead of water to go the other direction. A variegated wash is when you then mix in different colors, and it can be 1 or 10, doesn't matter. I do recommend, if you're trying to make it smooth, to try to follow the value. So here I had a dark value, it got lighter, lighter. So I took a light value of the next color, and then I might go deeper and deeper with the value as I go down, or not. But if I started at a really deep value here, the transition would be a little bit starker. And you might want that, but in this case, I want it just more smooth, kind of like a sunset or something like that. You can also do a clear wash. Some people, depending on the paper they're using, sometimes it does help the paper to be more workable. If you do a full wash of it and wet the paper down with just clear water and then let it dry, I don't know if it's because it removes the sizing or something like that, that maybe seals the paper a little bit and allows the paper to be more absorbent, but it really depends on the paper and your preference. But you can also do a clear wash and see how your paper, if it behaves differently if you do that. And then wash painting is basically kind of doing a wash, but instead of being really uniform and smooth, it's going to be really atmospheric and organic, and get a lot of maybe those color blooms. You can use various values or colors, and you do a wet on wet. So you just wet the page, and then you, with maybe one color, then you can drop in other colors. And like maybe you want it to be a really stormy day, so you're trying to get storm clouds. So instead of having it look like this sort of background sky, you want it to look like a stormy sky. So you can really play around with using that wet on wet technique and do a wash painting as a background. All right, here's kind of an example of putting a lot of these concepts together. And this is what I did, I think, last year. So the gradient wash, you can see the top part of the sky is a little bit darker, and then it slowly gets lighter and lighter as I go down. And then you can see these different tonal values. I did the lightest wash of the mountains in the background, and then I added a little more pigment, and I did the next row, and then I added a little more pigment and did the next row. And it's really good to practice this with just one color, so you're not getting confused with the colors. It's just, you're just practicing how to get those different values. Obviously, you're going to do that with colors too, and you can use different colors or add additional colors, mixing colors together, all sorts of things, which we're going to be going over when we do the color theory. But for these exercises, just to get familiar with the basics, pick any color other than yellow and try it out. This is an example of a wet on wet. See how nice organic that is. And then this is wet on dry. See those really hard lines. and it's pretty uniform look to the pigment. And then this is examples of some dry brushing. These are just some basic shapes with brushes, but you can see that white showing through. Those are some dry brush techniques. And like I said, it's nice to have that. That actually is a technique you will use, but you just want to do it when you're choosing to do it, not have it happen by accident. Okay, if we have time, I don't know if we will, we're gonna try out doing just a tonal painting, and this is what the original looks like. And I think what would be helpful for you, and you can choose whatever picture that you want, but just make sure it has high contrast, so from very light to very dark, so you can play around with your tones. And then and make sure it's, you know, kind of simple. And then I would suggest printing it or changing the color to at least a grayscale. Now this is a variation that I did with Photoshop Elements, where I actually can edit it to show a certain number of grayscale, and so it breaks it down even more. So I can use this to help me know exactly what my shapes of light and dark are, and that can help guide me in creating my painting. And then a few tips: paint from lightest to darkest, because this is a transparent medium, so it's going to show through. So if I put on this dark first, I can't work with it, anything underneath it. So I always start with the lightest shades and then work to the darkest. Remember that the paint does always dry lighter than what it may look like in your palette. So when you're mixing your values, just know that whatever it looks like on the palette, and then on the page first, it's going to be lighter still once it dries. And you can always get like a test page that you have handy, so you can see not only what it looks like on your palette, on your mixing palette, but also you can see what it looks like on the page, the paper. So you're getting, you know, and you know it dries lighter. So if you see what it looks like on the page, it just helps inform you to know where you're at with your values. And make sure that you mix enough paint for whatever your project, because if you're trying to get a specific value or even a specific color, once you mix that, it's not always easy to get that same exact one. So if you're trying to do, like, say I'm trying to do this whole area here and I want that a certain value, but let's say I get to here and I run out of paint, I have to try to match this. Now this is drying while I'm mixing up other paint to try to match, and then it's not exactly right. So I'm going to get a line here and it's going to be different. So try to make sure that you're mixing up enough of the whatever value, whenever you're doing mixing, whether it's values or colors, that you make enough so that you're not going to run out mid part of the project that you need that color for. All right, and that's all I have for the presentation part. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the demonstrations of these topics that we talked about. And this is actually just an old t-shirt I use for, I like to have an extra either paper towel or an old t-shirt just for cleanup. I don't want, you know, things that are like dirtier and I don't want on my regular cloth. So I kind of keep an extra rag or something for cleanup, or something that I just don't, like I said, I don't want to contaminate this cloth with. I will keep that handy as well. Okay, I'm going to try to open this. This paint is older, and I think there's a hole in the bottom of it. So I'm going to have to put that in a little baggie. The cool thing about watercolors, and I said this last time, is that they never harden. Like the acrylics, if it hardens in the tube, it's over, end game. But if it's watercolor and you cut you cut it open, you can just peel it back and use it from the tube. So I have my supplies. I've got my cloth. I've got my 2 water wells, my dirty water and my clean water. So I dip here first, then second. I have my paint. I'm going to just use indigo because I want to have a variety of values, and this will give me, I'll be able to get a pretty dark value. Now, this is more paint than I even need that I put down there. It just happened to be squeezing out kind of on its own. So, but a little does go a really long way. So I really only need a tiny, tiny bit of that. So the first exercise is just learning how to mix paint or just get started. And I'm going to use, this is some really inexpensive, very lightweight paper that I'm going to just use to check my colors. Because I don't care about this one. I have the other ones marked what they are, but I don't even know the brand of this, to be honest. So, and doesn't really matter what brush I use. So I'm just using this. This is actually like a Frank Clark Simply Painting brush. And it has a lot of, it looks like really fibrous and natural hair. So that's going to hold a lot of water and a lot of pigment. So always wet the brush first before you touch the paint. Don't go straight into the paint. So I'm just going to get basically get those bristles nice and saturated. And I'm still not like dripping with water. I'm getting, you know, taking off the excess water. And now I'm just going to touch into a little bit of that paint because this is a wet tube. It's going to activate very easily. So I'm just taking some of that pigment, moving it over to this area, but I'm not going to, I don't want to dig into that. I don't want to lift any of that paint. I just want to move the pigment. So I'm just slowly but surely dragging paint over here. And that's a nice dark mix. And you can see that the color here of this paint on the palette is pretty close to the color of the paint in the tube. So that's probably a pretty saturated level. So I'm going to get a nice dark value with that. Now I'm going to just dip in, and right now this is fairly clean. So I'm just going to, and this is a dirty brush. So I'm just dipping in there to get a little bit of water. And I'm going to mix that with some of this fully concentrated. Now you can create 5 different value wells, or you can just keep diluting the one well. I'm not going to use this paint for a project necessarily, so I'm just going to dilute it over here. So this is my most concentrated, and then this is a little bit more diluted. I'm going to add a little bit more water over here. It's staying pretty dark. So I'm going to add some more water. Okay. Now let's see if I get a lighter. Yeah, I'm getting definitely a lighter value of that paint. Now see how the water is kind of pulling up at the bottom of this? That's because this is on an angle, so it's moving all of my excess water there. Now to get rid of that excess water, you can either take a clean damp brush. Don't use a completely dry brush, but you want to pat it dry. Like you still want to wet it first. But I can just go in and just kind of wick out that, extra paint away with a clean, basically a clean and dry. And by dry, I mean I've blotted off, you know, much of the water. It's still going to be a damp brush, but to me, for this purpose, it's considered dry. All right, now over here, I'm going to take some of that medium pigment and I'm going to add more water. Now, what I would probably do is have this paper, because it's kind of not expensive paper, but it's still watercolor paper. And I would use this to test my colors. See how we're doing. Yep, we're getting lighter. And I could see, oh, is that too light, too dark? And then I could add more pigment or more water depending on what I need it to be. Now I'm going to take a little bit of this level over here. I'm wringing out my brush by just running it along that edge because this holds a lot of paint. Now I just dipped it back in. Okay, I'm just dipping it in water, just the tip, and then I'm adding that water there. That's going to make it even lighter. I want to mix it up real good so it's evenly. You know, I don't want it to be streaky, so I'm trying to just mix it up real well, and then I'm going to go ahead and put that down, and it's still lighter. These hairs are kind of falling out of this brush. It's an older brush. Okay, and then I'm going to take a little bit of that and move it even further over here. Try to wring out my brush a little bit if I can. It's not really letting go of too much. Then I'm dipping back in the water, going back over here, and I just have a really light wash. All right, now I want to completely rinse off my brush. I'm done with this exercise. I'm going to go into my dirty, and I'm kind of brushing the bottom of the jar gently to sort of wring out the pigment. I'm going to go ahead and run those bristles off the edge, and then I go back into the clean water, and you'll see that there's not a lot of pigment being released anymore because I got rid of it most in this tank. But now I have a clean brush. So let's say I go into the yellow pigment, I'm not going to now make green because I'm mixing this bluish coloring with my yellow and contaminate my color. So that's why if you have two, you get rid of the pigment here, and then you have a clean place to, you know, to make sure that you've gotten all the pigment out of there. All right, so that was the value exercise. That was the first exercise, which is kind of just getting started, mixing the desired value, and then loading the brush, and then brush to paper. And then we did the little value exercise where we practiced mixing and then diluting and mixing and diluting. And now let's just play around with some different brushes. I'm going to go ahead and mix up a nice good well. I'm going to keep this over here because I have a gradient, and if we do the final exercise, that tonal gradient painting, I might want it like that. So I'm going to create a new well over here of paint. So I'm just going to grab a little paint, just careful not to scoop up a big chunk of it, and I'm just going to move it over here. I want to make a nice big well because I don't care what I want it to all be consistent because I want to see what the brush does. So I want to mix a nice big well of one tonal value, pretty concentrated, so you can see I'm adding some more water. I'm adding more pigment. Now, even if this over here dries up, this section over here, all I have to do to reactivate it is add water. So it's, oh, and this is an inadvertent drip that I'm saying you don't want. Good example. If I pull it out of there and I don't run it off the edge, I could drip. So it's a good idea to have your water maybe, you know, off to the side closer to where your mixing trays are, not over your project. If I was doing an important project, I'd be a little bit more careful about that, but you do want to be aware of that. Right now I'm trying to add water, so I want it sort of dripping, but I have to be careful not to go over my painting if I want to do that. Nice big well. Okay, so now I have a lot of paint to work with. I'm mixing it up real good so it's consistent. color throughout. And then I'm just wringing out my brush there a little bit. Dirty, 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 dirty. Clean, 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 clean. Okay, and then drying my brush. If I'm not going to be using it right now, I'm kind of drying it. I'm pulling the bristles and shaping it the way I like, and then I'm going to just set that down and let it start drying. I can even just set it there. Okay, now I'm going to play around with different brushes. We already saw this one. That one would be a nice wash brush. This is actually, I'm going to show you this because this is a drafting tool and you can put ink in it, but you can also, and I don't know if I have it set up right for this, I might need to adjust it, but it's for creating a straight line. This is what the tool looks like. And if you can fill it, you can even use fountain, the fountain pens and things like that with watercolor to do straight lines, but this is in my brush jar, so I'm just going to show it. But it makes a nice straight line. So you could do rigor, like rigor lines. The faster I move, the thinner the line. So if I was trying to make, let me zoom in a little bit so you guys can see what I'm doing here. But see how nice a line that is? And again, you can use, you can fill a fountain pen, but this just is designed to make a good controlled horizontal line. So just another little.
Sorry, Shauna. What's on the end of that?
It's basically just, I think it's called.
Oh, I thought there was some hair or something on the end of that.
No, it's just 2 pieces of metal, and you can adjust this to create, a bigger or smaller gap. And that will adjust, I think, how much ink or whatever that releases. And I'm trying to remember the name of this. It's like a drafting pen or a rigger pen. I can't remember now. And of course it has no markings on there, but that's what it looks like. You might come across something like that.
Okay.
And that's what that can do. Usually if you go to like hobby stores or whatever, in the drafting section, they might have something like that. So that's a little bit easier more easy to control, to do straight lines than, for example, trying to do that with a brush, because a brush just can be a little bit trickier to keep a straight line because you're working with a softer material. Now you'll notice on this really thin paper, look at how much that paper is buckling. Do you see how it's sticking out there? It's just bubbling right up. And you can see it on the back side. See where I wet it? It's just, it's coming through on this side even. So that's what that 90 pound, which sounds like it would be thick enough, but I recommend at least 140 pound. And that's why. Because I think that this just doesn't handle, water. If you're doing a very light painting, like, these strokes and stuff, it does fine. If you're putting any kind of moisture on it, it's just going to have a harder time. That's all. All right. So let's start with round brushes. I'm just going to demonstrate a bunch of different round brushes, and I'm going to tell you what they're made of, because these are round brushes with different bristles. And then I'm just going to play around with them a little bit with some of those funky activities, and then see what it looks like, and play around on different paper too. So I'm going to start off with my smallest one. This one is a synthetic. Oops, sorry. It's a synthetic. So it's got a nice firm fibers. When I wet it and shake it, that's the tip. It's not, it's not the finest tip compared to some of my naturals, but it's not bad. And if you are going to use that and you don't get the tip that you want, you can just take your fingers, if you're trying to do something real fine, you can sort of pull it to a point if it doesn't do it naturally. With the natural brushes, all I have to do is flick it and it'll go naturally to a nice tip, but this one doesn't necessarily. So you might have to just help it along a little bit. Okay. I'm going to go into my pigment and let me bring this over. You guys can see. So I'm just loading the brush. Now I don't want it dripping. So see, if I go like that, it's going to drip. I can see the drip forming on the tip when I lift it up. I don't want that. And that's why I have the cloth. You can roll it off the edge to release that, or you can even dab it here. Dab a little bit before you go to your page. So if you want to control a little better. So the first thing I recommend is just see how far you can go without it running out of pigment. Starting to get dry. I can see some dry brushing and it's fading. So yeah, so there we go. So that went pretty far. Now I'm going to practice the drawing it, but pressing it down. So if I use the fine tip and I hold it more upright, I can get that finer tip. And then if I kind of angle it and press down, I'm going to get the body of it. And then if I lift back up and go back up, then I get that thin. So the lighter I touch it, the thinner the line I'm going to get. And then as I press down the body of the brush, I can get those thick lines. So if I press completely down, this is the widest line I can get with this brush. It's going to be hard to get much more unless I really try to splay them out. I can make a wider line by drawing it. I can draw pretty much any shape with this. These are good for if you're, filling in shapes, but it's nicer sometimes to, try not to do too many strokes with it, like, work it as least as possible. I'm just going to do little loop-de-doops. Now you can see when it starts to get dry, the bristles start to separate and you get that dry brush. So here it's real juicy and it doesn't do that. I can try like little wispy short strokes. This makes a nice, like if I'm doing a fence or something like that, I can make some nice lines. If I just dab, I can create some texture like that looks like leaves or things like that. So the round brush is very versatile, as you can see, and that's why it's a very popular brush. This is a very small, this is a size 4, so it's pretty small for this size painting, but would be fine if I was doing a smaller painting and wanted a little bit more detail. Okay, the next size that I have, this is a 6, and this is a Blick. This one's a Grumbacher. This is a Blick 6 Natural Squirrel. So back to, let me just show you, if I put it in the water, I'm putting it in the clean water, and I just flick it, it's gonna already go to that point. See, I didn't have to manipulate it. It just goes to that nice point. And that's one of the things about the natural versus the synthetic. It has that nice, really sharp point. Okay, I'm gonna go, this page is pretty well worked. I'm gonna go with this one. This is a Canson Cold Press 140. This is the one that I typically have been using. Actually, that's not the one I want to do. I'm going to use this other cheaper one. This one is another 90. This is a Canson 90 pound cold press as well. Swept my. Okay, wetting the brush, flicking into my mix. Now, each time I go into this, I'm mixing it because it's been sitting and so it may have started to dry. So I'm just making sure I'm getting a uniform mix. I'm releasing excess. And now I'm going to play with this. First, I'm going to try to create some really fine dots because look at that little point. So I'm using it like a pencil. So if I was trying to really create some, maybe like in the flower, I was trying to make some little, like, what are they called? The little pistils, or, you know, the little flower parts are small. I can get some really fine dots with that. Also, I can go from like a thin, very thin, and then I just press it down and it goes a pretty thick line. And then slowly lift it up and it goes back to thin again. And I can go to really, really thin. You know what? I think I'm going to add a little bit more pigment to this mix because I want it darker for you guys to see. I'm going to just use this guy. I really want you guys to see the color much better. It looks like a dark solution, but it's not on my paper very dark. Let's see if that's better. That's better. So I can get really some fine details there. I can also fill in areas. And this holds a lot of paint. It's that natural fiber. If I did that with the synthetic one, now this is a smaller brush to start with, but I'm going to really load it so it's almost dripping. And I try to fill in, I'm going to run out of paint pretty quickly. It's just not going to, it's going to just start lightening and dry brushing pretty quickly compared. Now, it's better if I can show you an example of a synthetic that's the same size, which I think I do have one here that is synthetic that I'll be able to do a side-by-side comparison. Yeah, these are both 10s and they're both by Blick. So I'm going to show, I'll show those side by side. But you'll just notice that if I'm correct, that you will be able to hold a lot more paint with those naturals. So creating like petals, you can do a point and then press it down and create like a petal that way, or you could press it down and then bring it up. And these are great for making leaves and things like that. So you can get different petal shapes, different leaf shapes. Little crescent moons. In fact, if I wanted to make a little, like an easy rose, you just do like a little C and then create a bunch of little C's, bigger and bigger. So there's a lot of versatility with the round brush. Let's try a little zigzaggy. kind of rotating, I can make a circle. And if I let it be dry, now I don't like to use this brush for that. I like to use cheap brushes. In fact, I'll do that with a cheap brush. I think I was showing you guys before, if you are using kind of a larger bristle brush and it's not as high quality, because you don't want to fray, because these are hairs and they'll fray just like our natural hair does. But if you use something that's just not as delicate, or that you don't care about as much because it's a cheaper brush, like this one, and I was showing you guys last time, look, I'm flipping, and this is all the tip I can get. I can't get much of a tip on that. That's just like really not giving me much of a tip. Even when I take my hand, it's just not going to give me a sharp tip. But if I kind of jam it in my hand a little bit, it's got these nice kind of fat bristles. I can get this really cool shape, and then I can make like foliage, like trees. Like that would make a really fun tree foliage with just some different colors, like fall colors. You can play around. So even the more inexpensive brushes that may not give you those points, they still have purposes. I have a hard time getting rid of any of the brushes, but they'll have their purpose. Okay, so I'm going to play around with this one. This is that one that's not real detailed, but it is natural. This is probably going to hold a ton of paint. Like I could probably fill this whole like page, because that, look at all of that. I mean, it holds a lot of paint. It's just going and going and going. It's not going to give me the detail, but it's going to be able to do a nice big, I mean, if I'm doing a smaller wash, I can definitely use something like that. It's almost kind of like a mop rather than a round. This is an example of a mop, just really, really bushy. It's still kind of a round shape, but it doesn't go to a tip. So this one kind of acts like that. Now I'm going to try to get it to as much of a point as I can and see how small of a, yeah, I can get a somewhat small line with it, but not too easily. I think this one does better for if I'm filling in. Like if I'm filling in an area with color, this would work just fine. Or if I'm doing a small page and I'm doing a wash, this would work just fine for that. It would work great as for washes. All right, now this is the side by side. I'm gonna get rid of that page. Now this one is, let's see, before I do that, I'm gonna do this one. This is a Strathmore 140-pound cold press. And I don't know if you're gonna be able to see, but it's pretty textured compared to this 140-pound. Let's see if that picks up on the camera. I don't know if you can see, this looks more textured to me, toothier than this one. This is that, it's like for a greeting card, and it's made out of watercolor. So I'm going to start with the synthetic, wetting my brush, mixing up my mix. Let's see what kind of a point I can get. That's a pretty good point. Now you have to be careful too. Notice how there's drops up here, and sometimes those will run down. And that's another reason to have the cloth. You can just, you're not taking any pigment off, but you're just keeping those drips from going down and dropping on your project too. So keep an eye out. If you dip your pin, your brush too deep in the water, you can get those. All right. Let's just see how. I can get a pretty fine tip. This for a larger brush, I'm just barely touching the surface. I'm getting a pretty thin line with that. So that's pretty good. And that's, like I said, the size 10. So that's bigger than the other one, but I'm getting pretty close to the same size as this. It's even thinner than the smaller, smaller brush. So it's got good tip on it. So that's good. Now I'm going to do like a tip and then body. So tip and then press down to get the body and then release up. So that gives me, it's not a real thick line. Let's see if I can make it thicker. So I'm spreading out those bristles. So I can get a little thicker line. So that's like a little leaf. Now if I hold it from this end, I don't have as much control, but I can kind of get more of an organic, you know, if I just want it to be messy, I may want to hold it over here so I'm not trying to control it too much and I'm real loose. Now this is wet and I'm just going to drop in some pigment in there just to play around with it a little bit. Now doing like a kind of a wash type technique. So this would be a nice wash brush. This really does a lot of different things. There's flicking. It really makes a very fine line considering the size. So I could use this for this size painting just fine. But I could also use it for a larger painting. It'll give me broad strokes and short strokes. It's probably not going to hold as much. In fact, let's do a side by side on that. This is I need more paper. Let's see how long the stroke lasts. Back this up a little bit. I'm going to see how long the paint lasts on this compared to the other one. So I'm going to load it up and then just going to see how long it takes before I run out of pigment. Starting to feel drier, but it's, you know, it's going for quite a long time. Now you can see that the bristles are starting to separate there. That's a sign of a dry brush starting to lose its, and I can even see a little bit of white showing through. So it's really, yeah. So it's pretty dry. I mean, it probably is going to make a little bit, but it's definitely getting harder to lay down the paint. Now let's look at this number 10, same size, but this one is the Sable, Master Sable. Let's see how this does. And the bristles aren't really separating still, so still feeling pretty wet. Okay, so I do definitely think that this shows that this is holding more. It's still not separating. Yeah, it can hold a lot of pigment, I would say. But they both make nice, pretty nice lines. And I do think that this puts down, like maybe it, I don't know if it just delivers the pigment differently, but it's given me a darker line, even though I'm using the very same mix. It's giving me more pigment here. So I feel like it's dry enough. So anyway, that's basically side by side, same size, just synthetic versus the natural. And then let's do some, see like how thick it is, how thick we can make it. This is the Sable. Pressing it down, and I'm really spreading out those bristles, and then I'm bringing it up. So it gives me a pretty wide berth on that. I can get a pretty wide spread of my bristles. Let's see, let's check the synthetic and see how that does. Yeah, it's already like separating. Look, it's already drying. It's already creating a dry brush effect on one stroke. It's a 10, right? Okay, just making sure I'm using the same one. So definitely I'm noticing, you know, I'm spreading out those bristles, but look at how those are separating, and I'm already getting the dry brush. So this definitely holds quite a bit more. I did not have that problem over here, and it laid down a lot more pigment. So that's just that example of that natural versus the synthetic and what it's capable of. Let me just try that again, and I'll show you that. Oh, that's that one's separating now. Well, now it's doing the same thing. Isn't that strange? Prove me wrong, why don't you? But that's weird because it did really well that time. Maybe I just didn't put enough. Oh, see, that time it's fine. I just didn't put enough pigment in, or I didn't let it absorb enough, I guess. Yeah, so this one holds fine. Quite a bit of pigment. Let me just see if I can give this more time to fill up or something, you know, to make sure I'm giving it a chance. It's a little better. Maybe not take off a lot off the side. That did a lot better. Oh yeah. So I'm not sure what happened. Maybe I just took off. It could be that it just releases more, you know, off the side easier because it's synthetic. And I just have to really make sure I'm not taking too much off the side when I do that. But I'm doing, it's getting pretty good here. It definitely, I still think, doesn't hold as much as the natural. So, and that's one of the known differences between the two. But it's negligible. I mean, you can use either one, is the bottom line. Oh my gosh, it's 8:47. Excuse me. All right, let's just do some quick marks with, okay, this is the Canson. I'll just do like a quick mark with each of these rest of these brushes. There's not really show and tell, but I do want to leave time for questions. So we're kind of running long. If you have to go, I understand. But I like to give you guys, you know, the most bang for your buck here. Okay, this is one of my bigger rounds. This is a 14, but you know, look, I didn't really even shake it, and look at that tip. That's a nice tip. This is a Kolinsky Sable, which is probably the best one that I have, because Kolinsky's supposed to be the best of the sables. So this is a pretty large brush. Let's see what happens if I can get a nice small. Oh yeah, look at that how small a line I can get with that big brush. That just gives me more versatility. I mean, that's practically like a hair's width. It's really a nice tip. All right, now I'm just gonna do my thin to thick exercise. See how wide we can get that. See how nice that is? And it just comes right back to its shape pretty quickly. And there's still plenty of paint on there. I mean, I didn't even reload. So I can go for quite a while without having to. Yeah, I mean, that holds a ton of paint. Look at that. So this is probably the best brush that I own. They're not inexpensive, but this is why, you know, you can go a long time without reloading them. So it saves your time on your painting. And also, you know, if you're doing a bigger painting, you're going to be able to go further. Now, of course, this is bigger than the other brushes too. So that's another reason why it goes further than these other brushes. This is Watercolor Sable. So this says Sable as well. It's not a Kolinsky, but very nice point. This is a 8 artist. This is a Winsor Newton. And it's got a nice long bristles on it for the size of it. Look how long those are. So that's going to also add to how much it can hold. Look at that compared to this. And actually the size of the ferrule opening, even though this is an 8 and this is a 6, it's smaller. So this actually has this is a smaller brush, but longer bristles. And the longer the bristles, it's just more surface area that paint can get into. So this one's going to go for a long time. Very nice point on it. But yeah, I can get a really nice thin point. Oops. Trying to do fast. And then I can. So that could probably, I think that could probably hold quite a bit as well, even though that's a smaller brush. So that holds a pretty good amount of paint. Not even showing signs of drying yet. Okay, this one is an 8 Blick. So this one, oh, this one was a 10. So the one I said was a 6 is not a 6, it was a 10. So that's why it's bigger than 8. Sorry about that. Okay, this one is a Sable as well, but not Kolinsky. Oh, it is a Kolinsky Sable 8. So this is the same size as that other one that I just did, which was a Sable, but not a Kolinsky Sable. Let's see if there's a difference. Very nice tip on it. It has some, you know, nice brush shape, about the same size. This one is not as long. No, this is a size 8 as well. So these are the same size, different. Oh, these are both Blicks, but they're different lines. So they could be different anyway, but they look fairly close. This one doesn't look a little bigger. The ferrule opening looks a little bit bigger, and they're definitely longer. It's definitely longer. So this one's probably going to hold a lot more paint. This one is a Squirrel. This one can hold quite a bit. It's a size 0 in this line, which just goes to show you that, you know, the sizes aren't the same. Because this wouldn't look like a 0 in any other line, but it's got a very nice tip on it. The softer bristle, it's harder for me to get a really, it holds a lot. So you can see I'm just putting down tons. I'm gonna have to wring it out a little bit because it's just too much paint. I'm having a hard time controlling it. So I'm take some off. There we go, that's better. Nice thin line. Thick to thin. And again, like I said before, this one bends quite a bit, but you know, I'm still able to do what I need to do. I may just, you know, if I want to keep doing that, it's just going to be, it's going to push down a little bit, but still able to do it. So it's not the end of the world. And this can hold quite a bit. Go the other direction.
You said that was a 0, Shauna?
Right. So this is Winsor Newton Series 250, and it is a 0. Yeah, the number. And that's what I mean by the numbers don't correspond to a specific size. They correspond to the number in that brand's series. So this might be the first one in the series, and then there's a size 1, size 2, size 3, and those are all going to be bigger, 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 bigger. So this might be the smallest one that they have in the series. I don't know, unless there's like a 0.5, I'm not sure, but the numbers have nothing to do specifically with the size. Within a particular brand and within a particular series, the larger you go, the bigger the brush. It's just that comparing brands to brand and series to series, you can't compare them because they have their own numbering system. It's just that this is the smallest one in that particular series, so it's 0. And the next size would be 1, but it doesn't matter whether that's a 1/2 inch or a 1 inch. It's just going to be a 1 because it's the next size, if that makes sense. So there's not a correlation between this number system and the size that's consistent throughout all brands. It's really specific to a brand and a series or series. So it can be tricky if you're following someone and they say, I'm using a 10, but they're using a Winsor Newton 10 and you're using a Blick 10, then it may not be the same size. So what you can do is you can ask them the size of the ferrule. They can measure the width of the ferrule. And if you go on the website, you might be able to find that information out because they might show you, as they might say, okay, a 14 is a 1/4 inch ferrule. And then you know that in whatever brand you're using, you just need a 1/4 inch ferrule, if that makes sense. Because this is the size, you know, and sometimes they have both. They'll have the exact measurement, or they might have it by millimeters. They could have it in the, depending on which country it's from, it may, or they might even have both. But okay, I do want to show this brush because I think that this is a cool brush, and I'm running out of time. So, as always. But I did want to show you the cool features of this. Now this is a mixed, it's kind of mixed synthetic and natural fiber. So it gives and it's cut to like a blade shape. It's called a stripper or striper, sorry. It's called a striper. And it's kind of angular. It's sort of like a little bit more extreme version of this shape here. So see, it's kind of at an angle. So see, when that's wet, it's just like a little bit sharper range of that. So, but this one's fun because you could do everything from a wash to some details to like even rigging because it has like such a fine point. So I can do, now this is my favorite paper. This is the Arches. And this is actually cotton. But I can run a pretty pretty sharp bead of a line. And then I can go really, really wide if I want. Now I won't be able to go forever wide, but I could, you know, make a pretty wide line with it too. So it's got a mix. I can also, like I do with the round brushes, I can go thin and then thick and then thin again. And then I could rotate the angle of it and it's even more like a round brush. So thin and then thick and then thin. So this one I was sideways and it makes a flat edge on one side. And then this one I rotated it this way versus this way. And then it's more like a round. So it acts like a flat and a round brush all kind of in one. Now it's a really soft brush, so it's going to be really hard to do like really fine details, but I mean, I can certainly, you know, do drawing with it. I can fill in shapes with it. You know, kind of like you would do in a round brush. I could fill in, you know, I could fill in shapes. So it has some flexibility. All right. And the last one is I did want to show you guys the wet on wet versus the dry. So most of this has just been dry. It's been wet on dry. So I just want to show you an example of the wet on wet. And I want to start with some just clear paint, clear water. And I'm just going to create a round, like a round moon. It's hard for you guys to see where the water is, but I can. And when you add paint to that, it's a little bit too much. I'm going to just dry off my brush a little bit, and I don't want it pulled up there. It's a little bit too much water. But okay, so you want a nice even sheen. And then if I add pigment to that, I'm just going to drop it in. Watch how that pigment just moves. And it's only going to move within that circle. So I can keep adding pigment and it's going to keep moving, but it's never going to go beyond that circle if I don't touch beyond the circle. So the circle that I made controls where it can go. So what I can do is if I want to move it within that circle, I can just kind of shift it around. You can see it's stopping at those edges. All right, so that's one thing I wanted you to know about the wet on wet. Obviously, I kind of messed up the organic of it because I added too much pigment. So I just want to do it one more time. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit of wetness. You can even like splatter some wetness, and then as you're painting, some of it will, you know, be wet on wet. Of course, I want a concentrated amount. There we go. Now we can actually see. But look at that bloom. Isn't that cool? How that moves. It's just so much more interesting than the dry. And different colors are going to behave differently. But isn't that fun? And lastly, I just want to kind of splash a little bit of like water so it's not completely everywhere. So if I paint through that, some of it's dry and some of it's wet, concentrated amount, I'm just gonna paint Some of it's going to go in dry areas and some of it's going in wet areas. And so you get a mix of this wet and dry, and it's just a really cool effect. Not fun. And then of course the dry and wet, I mean, just you get that uniform look. And I wanted to show you the washes, and I kind of demonstrated that a little bit, but basically I'm gonna not use this brush because I don't have a lot of space. And I like to use a flat brush for this, typically for my washes, depending on type of wash I'm trying to make. But so basically I can load my brush, and then I go across as far as the page, you know, that I'm doing. And then I'm going to reload because I'm out of water. And I'm starting right back, touching the wet bottom of that row that I already did. So it blends it through. And you just keep going back and forth, and you can create a wash. Now, if I was creating a gradient wash, I would just go lighter. Add more water. It's hard because I'm going over other pigmented things, but I could just keep adding a little bit more water, and I get a gradient, lighter and lighter wash. So you can kind of see. Now, if there's not enough pigment, if you get any kind of drying, you can get those lines. So you just have to be careful, but you can see they kind of smooth themselves out. You're not seeing those rows. It doesn't look like I created rows of paint because I'm going back in, and that's why it's good to have this angled. Where did my little tape go? So if I was doing a wash, I would have this at a little bit of an angle so that the water kind of runs down this way. So let's just, I wish I had another sheet of paper handy, but I don't have one handy. So go back in, go the other way. I'm back in that low line. And it keeps bringing that paint, that excess paint to that bottom edge. So when I go back across there, I'm basically just lifting that bottom edge with me. So I get a nice even line. One thing I see people doing is when they're trying to do this is they'll start to make like an arc because they're planting their elbow on the table. And if you do that, the natural movement of your hand is an arc. Or if you plant your wrist too, if you move your hand, you're making an arc. You don't want to make an arc when you're doing this. You want it to go straight across, especially if you're trying to create like a horizon line, because you want that to be straight. So just lift up your arm and go straight across the horizon. Don't plant your elbow, or else you're going to be tempted to get those arc shapes in your horizon, and that's not what you're going for. You want to get a straight horizon, especially like I said, if you're trying to create a horizon line, you want it straight across. It'll look weird if it's arced like that. Okay, I have to stop somewhere. I think I've covered most of what the exercises were. I didn't get a chance to do the monochromatic tonal painting, but hopefully I gave you enough tools that you can practice doing your own monochromatic tonal painting. And maybe we'll do that this month for watercolor. Actually, that's what I'll do for the Sunday watercolor at the meetup. If you're on meetup.com, I'll do a monochromatic tonal painting of that sunset. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Healing Art After Hours. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you find this content helpful. That lets YouTube know that our content is worthy. So please let us know. Thank you. Bye and happy creating.